I know what it feels like to make yourself small enough to disappear. I've spent 8 months perfecting it, moving through rooms like weather, present but unnoticed, cleaning surfaces I'll never own in a house that belongs to something far older than I understand. I told myself invisibility was safety, that if no one truly saw me, nothing could truly reach me. I was wrong, because on a Thursday night in November, two men stepped out of the Nebraska dark, and they didn't need to see me to hurt me. They just needed to see the uniform stitched above my heart. If you've ever made yourself smaller than you are just to feel safe, you already know this story. If something in you has been waiting for a place like this, stay. There's a space here for that feeling. This part of Nebraska has always felt older than it looks. The land holds things. You can feel it if you're quiet enough. The weight of choices made before you were born, pressing up through the frost like memory the earth refuses to release. I'd learned that feeling in my first week at the Muller estate. The way the air changed near the old iron gates. The way certain hallways went cold without reason. The way the estate itself seemed to breathe differently after midnight. Slower, deeper, like something enormous settling into sleep. I never let myself think too long about what that meant. 8 months. That was how long I had been a ghost inside those walls. Folding linen softer than anything I'd ever slept on. Polishing floors that reflected chandeliers I could never afford to stand beneath. The estate sprawled across 40 acres of land outside Lincoln. All dark stone and ancient wood, and windows that looked out over fields that seemed to go on forever, flat and silver under the winter sky. I learned its rhythms the way you learn a language you were never meant to speak fluently. Which corridors to avoid after sundown. Which doors were never left ajar by accident. When to be elsewhere. Adolf Muller himself was a presence I had learned to predict without ever truly knowing. I heard him sometimes in the upper rooms. Footsteps so measured and deliberate they barely disturbed the air. I caught glimpses through doorways. The line of a jaw, the pale stillness of a man who moved like he had never once been in a hurry because time had long ago stopped meaning what it means to the rest of us. He held audiences with people who arrived in black cars and left before the sun rose. I cleaned up after those meetings. I didn't ask questions. My job was to disappear. The only thing that made any of it bearable was knowing Renee was waiting. My younger sister, 24 years old and still living in our childhood apartment in Omaha, sending me voice messages about her coworkers and her terrible taste in television and the leftovers she kept forgetting to eat. She had our father's laugh. Easy, sudden, the kind that embarrassed her in quiet rooms. I sent her money every 2 weeks. Not much. Never enough. But I sent it because $61,000 in medical debt doesn't care that your father's gone. It doesn't care that you cried for 3 months and then had to stop because grief is expensive and you couldn't afford it anymore. The bills just keep arriving. Polite. Relentless. Patient in the way that only things without hearts can be. So I worked doubles. I took the extra shifts. I walked home alone when the late buses stopped running because cab fare was cab fare, and I had learned to calculate survival in very small denominations. Thursday night. November. The shift had run past midnight. The 2 miles between the estate's eastern gate and my rented room on Caldwell Street were miles I had walked dozens of times without incident. The road ran along the edge of the estate's outer territory, flat land, dead grass, the occasional farmhouse light blinking in the distance. Cold enough that my breath came in small white clouds. Cold enough that I walked fast, head down, hands buried in my jacket pockets. I didn't hear them until they were already in front of me. 2 men. Large. The kind of stillness that meant they had been waiting, not wandering, not passing through. Waiting specifically. One of them said something I didn't catch because my heart had already lurched into my throat and the sound of blood in my ears was very loud. Then the other one stepped closer. and his eyes dropped to the small embroidered crest above my coat's breast pocket. The Muller Estates mark, the one I wore on every uniform, the one I had never once thought to be afraid of. "There she is," he said quietly. "Just a cleaner." I tried to back away. I didn't make it far. The first blow caught my cheekbone, and the world tilted sideways. The second drove the air from my ribs in a sound I had never made before, something between a gasp and a surrender. I remember the cold of the road coming up to meet me. I remember thinking about Renee, about her voice message from that morning, the one I hadn't answered yet. I remember thinking, don't lose consciousness. If you lose consciousness out here, no one will find you until morning. I didn't lose consciousness. Not entirely. They left me on the road. Not because they were merciful, because they had delivered what they came to deliver. I lay still for a long time, listening to the wind move through the dead grass. Then I got up.
I don't know how.
I walked the rest of the way home with one hand pressed to my ribs and my vision doing something unsteady at the edges. I climbed the stairs to my room. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and breathed until breathing felt possible again. I did not call Renee. I did not call anyone. I had spent 8 months learning to be invisible.
I was not ready to stop.
Not yet. I told myself it was fine. That's what you do when you've been surviving long enough. You look at the damage in the mirror, you make the calculations, and you tell yourself it's fine. Not because it is, but because the alternative is sitting down and not getting back up, and you stop being able to afford that a long time ago. The concealer was the expensive kind, the one I'd bought 8 months ago for a job interview and had been rationing ever since. I applied it in thin layers the way the woman at the drugstore counter had shown me once, blending the edges until the bruise on my cheekbone became a shadow, became a suggestion, became something you'd have to be looking for to find. The long-sleeved shirt covered my arms. The way I held myself, careful, measured, weight shifted slightly right, I had practiced that in the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes before I left. I had a system. I have always had a system. Renee called while I was on the bus. I let it ring, then felt sick about it. Then sent her a text that said busy, call you tonight, which was a lie in the way that all survival lies are lies. Technically untrue, emotionally necessary, something you tell yourself you'll explain later, when everything is less. The estate looked exactly as it always did.
Permanent.
Indifferent. The kind of beautiful that doesn't notice whether you're standing in front of it or not. I signed in at the service entrance, took my cart from the supply room, and went to work. The east corridor windows were my first task. Floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the frost-gray grounds, the kind of windows that showed you everything, the flat Nebraska sky, the bare-limbed trees along the eastern fence, and your own reflection whether you wanted it or not. I kept my eyes on the glass and not on what it showed me. I moved slowly,
Carefully.
each reach of my arm a negotiation with the ribs that had spent the night reminding me what had happened. I was good at this. Pretending nothing had happened. I had been good at it for years. I didn't hear him come in. That was the thing about Adolf Muller that I had learned not to think about too carefully. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. One moment the corridor was empty. The next, there was a stillness at the far end of it that had weight and temperature and age, and I knew without turning that he was there. I kept polishing.
He didn't speak.
Didn't move. Didn't do the thing that humans do when they enter a room. Shift, breathe audibly, fill the space with small, unconscious noise. He simply stood at the end of that corridor and watched me, and the silence stretched out between us like something being measured. I made it 40 more seconds before I had to turn. He was looking at my face. Not glancing. Not noticing in passing. Looking, with the particular quality of attention that belongs only to things that have had centuries to learn what patience actually means. His eyes were very still. His expression was the same careful neutrality I had observed from doorways and corridor ends for 8 months. But underneath it, in the part of him that was older than the language I thought in, something had shifted. "I fell," I said, "on the service steps. Yesterday evening. They were wet." He didn't respond. I should have reported it. "I'll fill out the incident form today. Which step?" His voice was low, unhurried. The way deep water is unhurried. I blinked. "Pardon? Which step did you fall on?" I opened my mouth. The lie I had prepared, the third one, near the bottom, I lost my footing on the left side, dissolved before I could form it. Because the way he was looking at me made something very clear. He already knew.
He didn't need the answer.
He was giving me the opportunity to tell the truth, and he would wait as long as it took, because 5 centuries had taught him that the truth always surfaces eventually. "You're protecting your right side," he said quietly. "But the bruising is on your left. The swelling at your cheekbone is approximately 18 hours old. And you have been breathing in increments since you walked in, the way people breathe when a deep inhale costs them something." He paused. "That is not a fall." The cleaning cloth in my hands felt very small. "I'm fine," I said. "Because that is the other thing you say when you have been surviving long enough. It is the sentence you use when every other sentence has run out." He crossed the corridor.
Slowly.
Without urgency. And stopped close enough that I could feel the cold that lived in him, not unpleasant, just ancient, like standing near stone that has never seen direct sun. His hand came up and very carefully, with a precision that felt almost like grief, he turned my face toward the light from the windows. He looked at what the concealer had been hiding. The silence went so deep it had texture. Then he said my name. Not the cleaner.
Not you.
My name, Melissa, in a voice that made it sound like something he had been holding carefully for a long time, something he had not expected to need. I hadn't known he knew it. 8 months of invisibility. 8 months of moving through his house like weather, like furniture, like something that required no acknowledgement. And he had known my name the entire time. Something broke open in my chest that I hadn't realized was sealed.
"Tell me," he said.
Not a request.
Not quite a command.
Something older than both. Tell me what happened. And God help me, I did. He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. Through the examination, through the long, careful hours of that afternoon, through everything that followed in the dark. He didn't rage. He didn't pace. He simply listened to me tell him what happened on that road, and when I finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the frost settling against the windows. And then he turned and pressed a single button on the panel near the door. That was all. One button. One motion. The kind of efficiency that belongs to something that has handled catastrophe so many times it no longer needs volume to communicate its weight. Bertram arrived in under a minute. I had seen him before in the way I had seen most of the estate staff. Peripherally, carefully, the way you observe things you instinctively understand you're not supposed to ask about. He was older looking than Adolf, broader, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent centuries learning how to stand in a room without being underestimated. He took one look at my face, and his expression didn't change. That was somehow worse than if it had. Adolf spoke to him quietly. I caught fragments, a name I didn't recognize, a word that sounded like a place, Detroit, and then 4 words delivered in a register so low and so absolute that I felt them more than heard them. I don't know exactly what those 4 words were. I know what they meant. Bertram left without a sound. Then Adolf turned back to me and said, with the same unhurried quiet he had used to dismantle every lie I'd offered that morning, "There's a physician on the estate. You will see her now." I tried to object. I remember opening my mouth, forming the beginning of some reasonable protest about finishing my shift, about the windows in the East Corridor, about how I was fine. I was always fine, I had made a practice of being fine. He looked at me with 5 centuries of patience and said nothing. Just waited for me to hear myself. And I did.
I heard how it sounded.
How thin it was. How much work it took to keep insisting on your own smallness when someone was standing in front of you refusing to agree with it. I stopped objecting. The physician was a woman named Dr. Irina Voss. Quiet, precise, with hands that moved like she had been doing this since before modern medicine had a name for what she was doing. She confirmed 2 fractured ribs and a hairline crack along my left cheekbone with the same clinical neutrality she might have used to describe the weather. She wrapped my torso in a compression bandage that made breathing feel possible again for the first time in almost 20 hours. She gave me something for the pain that tasted bitter and worked within minutes. She did not ask how it happened. I understood that she already knew. I was given a room in the estate's east wing. Not the staff quarters, an actual guest room, with a bed that faced tall windows and curtains the deep color of a winter sky just before dark. I sat on the edge of it for a long time after Dr. Voss left, still in my work clothes, hands folded in my lap, trying to process the architecture of a day that had begun with concealer and careful breathing and ended here. I thought about calling Renee. I picked up the phone the estate had given me. My own had died sometime during the examination, and held it for a long time. Then set it down.
I didn't know what I would say.
I didn't know how to describe what was happening in this house in language that wouldn't frighten her, and she frightened easily when it came to me. She always had. Ever since our father died, she'd had this way of listening for disaster in the pauses between my words, and I was not ready to give her something real to find. So, I sat with the silence instead. Watched the Nebraska dark settle over the grounds through the tall window. Watched the frost make its slow, patient claim on the glass. I don't know what time I finally lay down. I know I didn't sleep. At 3 a.m., I heard the cars return. Not loudly. The estate didn't do anything loudly. Just the low sound of tires on the stone drive, doors closing with careful precision, and then footsteps. More than 2 sets, heavier than they had left. A murmur of voices below. Then Bertram's voice, briefly, delivering something to someone waiting. And then silence of a different quality than before. The kind of silence that exists after something has been concluded. I lay still in the dark and waited for what I knew was supposed to come next. The guilt. The horror. The reasonable human response to understanding that men had been brought to this house in the night because of something that happened to me. I waited. It didn't come. What came instead was something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Something quiet and deep and shameful in its simplicity. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of setting down a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The feeling of someone standing between you and the dark and meaning it. I pressed my hand flat against my wrapped ribs. Felt the slow, steady rise and fall of my own breathing. Thought about the 2 men on that road. About what they had decided I was: a message, a prop, something useful for a moment and disposable after. Thought about the 4 words Adolf had spoken in a voice like the bottom of a river.
No.
The guilt didn't come. And lying there in a room I hadn't earned in a house that belonged to something ancient and absolute, I understood something about myself that I hadn't been willing to look at before. I was tired. Not of working. Not of surviving. Tired of being someone the world kept deciding didn't matter enough to protect. Somewhere below, the estate settled back into silence. I closed my eyes. For the first time in 8 months, I slept without keeping one part of myself awake to listen for danger. Healing is a quieter violence than people tell you. There is nothing dramatic about it. No moment where the pain lifts and light pours in. It is just days, one after another, where your body argues with everything you ask of it, where the smallest movements cost more than they should, where you lie still at 2 in the morning and listen to yourself breathe and try to remember what it felt like before every inhale was a negotiation. I had healed from things before.
Grief. Death.
The specific exhaustion of being the person in a family who holds everything together after the one who held you is gone. I knew how to be patient with damage. I knew how to wait. What I didn't know how to do was accept being watched over. It started small enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The first morning, I woke to find tea on the side table by the window. Not coffee, tea, the specific kind I'd been buying for myself from a small shop in Lincoln since I arrived in Nebraska, the one I'd never mentioned to anyone because it was such a small private thing. The kind of comfort you keep quiet because you've learned that small private things are all you reliably get to keep. It was prepared exactly right. The temperature, the color, the single spoon resting on the saucer at the angle I preferred. I sat with it for a long time before I drank it, trying to understand what it meant that he knew. The second day, I woke to find my pillow had been adjusted while I slept, repositioned to support the angle Dr. Voss had specified, the one I kept losing in the night. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't felt anything. Just woke to find the world slightly more arranged for my comfort than I had left it, as if the house itself had turned its attention toward me. I knew it wasn't the house. The third day, I made it downstairs to the east sitting room, slowly, one hand trailing the wall, ribs making their familiar complaint, and found the fire already lit, the footstool positioned at the exact height that would let me rest without bending. I stood in the doorway for a long moment just looking at it, at the deliberate, careful intelligence of it. The way it said, "I knew you were coming here before you did." He appeared in the doorway of that room at noon, without announcement, without pretense. He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the corridor, not through me, not past me, but at me, with a quality of attention I had spent 8 months believing I was invisible enough to escape. "You haven't eaten this morning," he said. Not a question. I thought about lying, decided I was too tired and in too much pain to perform it convincingly. I wasn't hungry. That's not what I said. He left, returned 7 minutes later with a plate that contained exactly the things I would have chosen if someone had asked me, which no one had. Set it on the table beside me with the same wordless precision he brought to everything. Then stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the frost-gray grounds as if he had simply been passing through and stopped for no particular reason. I ate. Because my ribs hurt and I needed the medication and the medication required food. And because somewhere in the architecture of the past 3 days I had begun to understand that arguing with him was a specific kind of exhaustion I couldn't currently afford. He didn't speak while I ate. Neither did I. But the silence between us had changed from what it was in the corridor. It had lost its edges. Renee arrived on the 4th day. I hadn't asked her to come. She called on the 3rd evening, and I made the mistake of answering. And within 30 seconds, she had heard something in my voice that I hadn't intended to leave there, some small, unguarded tremor of a woman who is tired of being fine. And 12 hours later, her ancient Honda was coming up the estate service drive with her inside it, wearing the expression she'd been perfecting since we were children. The one that meant I already know, and I came anyway. She held me for a long time in the guest room doorway, careful of my ribs in the way that told me Dr. Voss had already spoken with her. Then she pulled back and looked at my face and pressed her mouth into the flat line that meant she was not going to cry because one of us had to hold it together. "Okay," she said. "I need to meet him. I should have warned him. Looking back, I should absolutely have warned him." She found him in the kitchen the following morning. Him, in a space that felt almost surreal for his presence, pale and ancient and utterly composed, standing near the window while the estate's cook moved around him with the practiced indifference of long familiarity. Renee walked in, looked at him once with our father's direct brown eyes, and said, "Are you going to hurt my sister?" The cook went very still. Adolf looked at Renee with an expression I had never seen on him before, not quite surprise, because I suspected very little surprised him anymore, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration. "No," he said. "Are you going to get her killed because someone wants to use her to get to you?" A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The difference mattered. "I would sooner burn this estate to the ground," he said, "than allow that." Renee studied him for a long moment with the ruthless assessment of a younger sister who has spent her whole life watching the world decide whether her family was worth protecting. Then she nodded once, the way our father used to nod when he'd made up his mind about something. "All right," she said, and went to make herself coffee as if the conversation had been entirely ordinary. I watched from the doorway, compression bandage tight around my ribs, tea cooling in my hands. Watched this 500-year-old king stand in a kitchen in Nebraska being quietly interrogated by my 24-year-old sister and not flinch, and not deflect, and not offer her the polished reassurances that powerful men usually hand to the people they want to stop asking questions. He had answered her like he meant it. Like the answer was not something he'd had to calculate. Something shifted in my chest that I didn't have words for yet. Something that scared me more than the bruise had. More than the ribs. More than any of it, because pain I knew how to survive. I had been surviving it my whole life. This was something else entirely. And I was not at all sure I knew how to survive being chosen. 3 weeks is long enough to start feeling guilty about stillness. I had never been good at being tended to. My whole life had been organized around motion, the next shift, the next payment, the next thing that needed doing before someone noticed it hadn't been done. Stillness felt like a luxury I hadn't earned, and even with 2 fractured ribs insisting otherwise, some part of me kept looking for ways to be useful, to justify the space I was taking up. So, on the 22nd night, I found the archive room. I hadn't been sent there. No one had asked me to touch it. I'd passed the door a dozen times in 8 months without ever opening it because it sat at the end of a corridor I had no assigned reason to enter. But the door was unlocked, and something in me, the part that cannot leave a disordered thing alone, that cannot walk past a broken latch or an unwatered plant without stopping, turned the handle anyway. The room was extraordinary and completely neglected. Shelves from floor to ceiling, documents stacked without system, some in folders, some loose, some in cases that looked older than the country.
Maps.
Ledgers. Correspondence in at least 4 languages, some in alphabets I didn't recognize. The kind of accumulation that happens when someone has been alive long enough that history stops feeling like something worth organizing and becomes simply the sediment of continued existing. It took me 10 minutes to understand the scope of it. It took me another 5 minutes to find a chair, sit down carefully with one hand bracing my ribs, and start. I don't know how to explain what happens to me when I organize things. It isn't a skill exactly. It's closer to a compulsion, the way some people can't leave a crooked picture frame alone. I see disorder, and my mind immediately starts sorting, categorizing, building the architecture of sense from chaos. My father used to say I came out of the womb looking for a system. He said it like it was a flaw. I think he meant it as a compliment. With him, it was hard to tell. I worked for 2 hours. By midnight, the Eastern Shelf was sorted by century, documents grouped by origin, a logic emerging from the chaos that hadn't been there before. My ribs ached steadily. I ignored them with the practice of someone who has had a lot of experience ignoring what their body is trying to tell them. I didn't hear him come in. I never heard him come in. "You reorganized the herb garden in your 2nd week." His voice came from the doorway, low and unhurried, and I managed not to startle badly enough to hurt myself, barely. I turned. He stood with one hand resting against the doorframe, still dressed, as if the hour meant nothing to him, which of course it didn't. His eyes moved across the shelves I had worked on, reading what I had done with an attention that was almost archaeological. The previous arrangement was aesthetic, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Grouped by color. It looked beautiful, but it made no practical sense. Plants with the same growth cycles were separated. The ones that needed shade were getting full sun. I know. He stepped into the room. I watched you do it. You spent 40 minutes and you never asked permission, and you left no note explaining the change. I hadn't thought anyone had noticed. It was the second week. I was still learning where everything was, still mapping the estate's rhythms, still performing the particular invisibility I had spent years perfecting. I had fixed the garden the way I fixed everything in those days. Quietly, completely, without leaving evidence of myself behind. The greenhouse latch, he said. The broken one on the north door. You repaired it with wire from the supply room in March. I found it 3 days later. The precision of it, March, as if he had been keeping a record, made something move through my chest. Someone would have gotten hurt on it eventually, I said. Yes. He stopped a few feet from me, looking not at the shelves but at me, with that quality of absolute attention I had stopped being able to pretend was impersonal. Someone would have. But you were the only one who saw it. The only one who stopped. The archive room was very quiet. Outside, Nebraska settled into its deep November dark, the kind of dark that has no bottom. I don't understand it, he said then, and something in his voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but closer. The way a door sounds different when it opens versus when it's simply unlocked. I have watched people walk through this house for longer than your country has existed. Servants, advisors, guests. They come and they leave, and they take nothing with them and leave nothing behind. And then you arrived, and from the second week I found myself, he stopped. As if the word he needed was in a language he had not used in a long time. He crossed the remaining distance between us and raised his hand, and I understood it wasn't reaching for me. It was reaching towards something he had thought was no longer in the world. His fingers touched my face. Not the bruise, which had faded now to a yellow shadow. The undamaged side. Just the line of my cheekbone, traced with a precision that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with grief. The specific grief of something ancient recognizing something it had given up expecting to find. I had been touched gently before. But not like this. Not by something that had survived centuries of loss and was touching me like I was evidence that tenderness had not been entirely extinguished from the earth. My eyes burned. I did not pull away. I could have told myself it was the ribs. The exhaustion. The accumulated weight of 3 weeks of being cared for by something that expected nothing back. I could have built a very reasonable explanation for why I sat there in an archive room at midnight and let a 500-year-old king touch my face like I was the most careful thing he had ever held. But I was 29 years old, and I had learned to stop lying to myself about the things that cost me the most. I was not invisible to him. I had never been invisible to him. And for the first time in longer than I could honestly measure, I wasn't sure I wanted to be. I knew what the meeting was before he told me. Not the details, not the name, not the location, not the particular calculus of vampire politics that had made it necessary. But I had lived in that estate long enough to understand the atmosphere of consequence. The way Bertram moved through the corridors with a different quality of purpose. The way the household staff found reasons to be elsewhere. The way Adolf himself carried a stillness that was distinct from his usual stillness, more deliberate, the way a blade is different from a stone even when neither is moving. He came to find me the morning before. I was in the archive room again. My 3rd consecutive evening there, the west shelves almost finished now, a system emerging that felt like the one the room had always been waiting for. He stood in the doorway and watched me work for a moment before he spoke, and I had learned by then not to fill his silences with nervous conversation. I had learned to wait him out. It had taken most of my life to learn that particular patience, and it turned out he was the first person I had ever met who made it easy. "There is a meeting tomorrow night," he said. "I would like you to come." I set down the folder I was holding.
Why?
Not a performance of casualness. A genuine question, because I had also learned that he did not say things without architecture behind them, and I wanted to understand the blueprint before I agreed to stand inside it. "Because Gregor Vass needs to understand something," Adolf said, "and there are things that cannot be communicated with words alone." I thought about that for a long moment, about what it meant to be brought to a table where the language spoken was centuries old, and the stakes were things I could only partially see. About what it meant to be used as a message, which was, after all, exactly what had started all of this. Two men on a dark road deciding I was a sentence in a conversation I hadn't consented to enter. Am I leverage?
I asked. No.
Immediate.
Certain.
You are a line. There is a difference. I understood the difference. A piece of leverage can be negotiated away. A line cannot. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling its weight, feeling what it meant that he was asking instead of deciding. "All right," I said. The venue was a private room in a hotel in Lincoln that looked from the outside like nothing at all, the kind of place designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away from it. Inside, it was all dark wood and low light, and the particular silence of a space that had absorbed too many difficult conversations to hold any tension of its own anymore. Gregor Vass was already seated when we arrived. I had constructed a version of him in my mind over the past weeks, built from fragments, from Bertram's tone when he said the name, from the quality of Adolf's response when the Detroit connection was confirmed. I had expected something theatrical, something that announced itself. He was instead a man of middle years who looked like he had been carved from something cold and left to settle. Well-dressed, unhurried, eyes that moved to me the moment I entered and did not move away, cataloging with a thoroughness that was meant to be felt. Adolf's hand came to the small of my back, not possessively, precisely. A placement, not a gesture. This is where she is. This is where she stays. We sat. Pleasantries were exchanged in the tone that powerful men use for pleasantries, that particular register where every courteous word has a second meaning underneath it that only the fluent can hear. I kept my hand still in my lap and my face neutral and thought about my father, who had taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do in a room full of people performing composure is let them see you reaching for yours. Then Vass looked at me with something that was almost a smile and said, "I understand she's a cleaner." The room temperature did not change. Adolf did not move. He simply looked at Gregor Vass across the table with 5 centuries of accumulated consequence behind his eyes and said, very quietly, something I will not repeat here because I think some things belong only to the rooms where they are spoken. But I watched Gregor Vass go very still. The kind of still that isn't composure, the kind that is a body understanding on a level below thought, that it is in the presence of something it cannot afford to test further. The meeting ended shortly after. In the car, I sat beside Adolf in the particular silence of two people who have just come through something together and are still taking stock. The Nebraska dark moved past the windows. The estate lights appeared eventually in the distance, amber and steady, and I watched them approach and thought about lines and leverage and the distance between them. "I won't live in a cage," I said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever this is, whatever is happening between us, I will not trade one kind of invisible for another. I won't be kept." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I mean it, Adolf. I know you mean it." He turned to look at me then, and there was something in his face that I had not seen there before. Not the grief from the archive room, not the cold precision of the table we had just left. Something undefended. Something that had, perhaps, been waiting a very long time for the right person to say exactly what I had just said. I have spent 500 years building walls, he said. Room by room, border by border. Every wall justified, every boundary necessary. A pause. I find lately that I no longer want to be the one inside them. The estate gates opened ahead of us. I looked at his profile in the low light. This ancient, complicated, devastating thing that had fixed my tea and adjusted my pillow and stood in a corridor and said my name like he had been holding it carefully, and felt the truth of what I was standing at the edge of land that I could not see the bottom of and choosing, with full knowledge of the cost, to step forward anyway. Not because I wasn't afraid, because some things are worth being afraid of. And for the first time in my life, I was one of them. There are other women in this world, women who found something ancient watching them from the dark, something that chose them when they had stopped choosing themselves. Their stories are here too. If you don't want to lose your way back to this place, subscribe. These stories don't always find you twice.